The restaurant was alive with the soft glow of golden lights, the clinking of glasses, and the quiet hum of conversations. It was the kind of place where wealthy men and women gathered after a long day, hoping to enjoy fine food, expensive wine, and the comfort of being surrounded by elegance. The waiters moved gracefully between the tables, their black and white uniforms perfectly pressed, their smiles carefully practiced. Everything was calm, polished, and well arranged, until he arrived. The man stepped through the tall glass doors with the kind of confidence that demanded attention. His shoes were shiny, his suit looked as if it had been stitched by the most expensive tailor in town, and the thick gold watch on his wrist gleamed under the lights. He didn't need to speak to let people know he was rich. His presence alone announced it. Heads turned as he entered, and even those who pretended not to notice couldn't resist sneaking a glance. The hostess rushed to greet him, bowing her head politely. He didn't smile. Instead, he looked around the restaurant as if inspecting it, like a king entering his court. His lips curled into the faintest smirk, the kind of expression that suggested he believed no one else in the room was as important as him. He followed the hostess to the best table in the center of the room and sat down heavily as if the chair owed him something. From the very beginning, his attitude made the staff uneasy. When a waiter brought him a menu, he snapped his fingers impatiently and said, "Water, sparkling, cold, and don't take too long." His voice was sharp and commanding, like a man used to giving orders and having them obeyed without question. The other guests noticed him too. Some whispered quietly while others shook their heads. They had seen men like him before, rich, arrogant, and eager to make sure everyone else knew it. But no one said a word. In a place like this, money often gave people the freedom to be rude without consequence. The waitress assigned to his table was a young woman who had been working there for several months. She carried herself with quiet dignity, though the long shifts and heavy trays often left her exhausted. Tonight was no different. When she approached his table with a gentle smile, he barely looked at her. He waved his hand in the air dismissively as if she were nothing more than a servant in his mansion. "What's good here?" he asked, his tone not curious but challenging, as if daring her to impress him. She explained politely about the chef's special, the roasted lamb with herbs, and the fresh seafood delivered that morning. He didn't listen to her words, at least not fully. He watched her face instead, his eyes sharp and judging. When she finished, he gave a short laugh and said, "I suppose you wouldn't know real taste anyway, would you?" The words were heavy with insult, but he spoke them casually like a man tossing crumbs to the floor. The waitress didn't flinch. She had met people like him before, people who believed money gave them the right to look down on others. Instead, she simply nodded, wrote down his order, and moved away. But deep inside, she felt the sting of his words. Still, she chose silence. After all, she was there to do her job, not to argue with arrogance. As the evening went on, the rich man ordered more wine, each glass making him louder and bolder. He laughed too hard, spoke too loudly, and gestured with his hands in a way that drew attention to himself. The restaurant, once filled with soft, calm energy, now felt tense under his presence. Some guests whispered about leaving early, while others watched with curiosity, waiting to see what he would do next. The piano in the corner of the room stood quietly, untouched. On most nights, a musician would come to play soft melodies, filling the air with warmth. But tonight, the piano was silent, and it seemed almost invisible, until the rich man's eyes fell on it. He smirked again, that same smug expression that hinted at mischief. He leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers on the table as if already planning something. The staff exchanged nervous glances. They had seen this look before, the kind of look that meant he was about to make someone uncomfortable for his own amusement. For now, he said nothing about it. But the piano, quiet and waiting in the corner, had already caught his attention, and soon it would become the center of the story. The evening had just begun, but it was clear to everyone in the room that his presence would not allow it to remain peaceful. Something was brewing, something that would test not just the patience of the staff but the strength of one woman in particular. The rich man believed the night belonged to him, that he could bend it to his will just as he bent people to his commands. What he did not know, however, was that before the night ended, this very restaurant would witness a moment he could never have expected. The young waitress moved quietly between tables, balancing trays of steaming dishes and sparkling glasses. Her black and white uniform was neat but slightly faded from too many washes. Though her steps were graceful, her shoes were worn, carrying the marks of long hours spent on polished floors. Her name was Clara, though most people at the restaurant never bothered to ask. To them, she was simply the waitress, someone whose smile was expected, whose patience was taken for granted, and whose hard work often went unnoticed. Clara had been working at this restaurant for nearly a year. She wasn't born into wealth, nor had she ever lived a life of luxury. Instead, she had grown up in a modest neighborhood where neighbors looked out for each other, and children played in the streets with laughter as their only treasure. Life had not been easy, but she carried her struggles with quiet strength. Behind her warm smile lived dreams no one could see. Clara loved music. From the time she was a little girl, she had been drawn to the piano. The way the keys produced melodies felt like magic to her, as if her fingers could turn emotions into sound. But lessons were expensive, and her family could not afford them. Instead, she learned by ear, teaching herself on an old second-hand keyboard a neighbor once gave her. Many nights after finishing her chores, she would sit by the little keyboard in her small apartment playing until her heart felt lighter. Yet, at the restaurant, Clara kept this part of her life hidden. Customers came for food and wine, not to hear about the dreams of the staff serving them. To them, she was just a face that appeared with their meals, someone to refill their glasses and clear their plates. And she accepted that, at least on the outside. That night, as she carried a tray of dishes past the rich man's table, she felt his eyes on her. His gaze wasn't kind. It was sharp, filled with the arrogance of someone who believed he was above her. She ignored it, focusing instead on her work. She placed food carefully in front of another group of guests, bowing slightly with her usual gentle smile. They thanked her, but she barely heard them. Her mind was already racing, sensing that the man in the expensive suit would cause trouble before the night was over. When she returned to his table to bring the sparkling water he had demanded, he looked at her in a way that made her uneasy. "You," he said, pointing at her with the casual cruelty of someone who thought giving orders was a game. "Do you enjoy working here?" Clara kept her voice calm. "Yes, sir. I'm grateful for the opportunity," he smirked. "Grateful, huh? Well, I suppose that's all people like you can be. Grateful." The word stung, but she forced herself to stay composed. She nodded politely and walked away, her heart heavy but her face unchanged. She couldn't afford to lose this job. She couldn't afford to let her pride answer for her. As the evening wore on, Clara continued to serve table after table, carrying plates that were heavier than they looked, smiling even when her feet ached, and responding with patience even when customers were rude. That was her life, endurance, quiet endurance. She had learned long ago that dignity sometimes meant swallowing your pain and continuing forward step by step. But inside, Clara carried a spark no insult could dim. She remembered her late mother's words. "You were born with a gift, Clara. Don't ever let anyone convince you that you're less than what you are. Music will always be your voice." Those words echoed in her heart whenever life seemed unfair. At the far end of the restaurant, the piano stood quietly, almost forgotten that evening. Most nights, Clara barely gave it a thought. She was too busy rushing between tables, too focused on keeping her balance and remembering orders. But tonight, as she glanced at it, she felt something strange, almost like the piano was watching her, waiting for her, calling to her. She quickly pushed the thought away. After all, she was just a waitress. Her place was here, carrying trays and refilling glasses, not there sitting before those keys, and yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that the piano's silence was somehow connected to what the night still held. She didn't know it yet, but before the evening ended, that piano would no longer be silent, and her life would never be the same. Meanwhile, the rich man leaned back in his chair, sipping his wine, his eyes scanning the room with arrogance. He tapped his fingers on the table, not out of boredom, but as though plotting something. Clara felt his gaze again, lingering on her as she passed by. She straightened her back and kept her eyes on the floor. The man gave a low chuckle, the kind of laugh that carried no joy, only mockery. "Let's see how long this little game lasts," he muttered under his breath. The restaurant around them buzzed with soft conversations, the clinking of forks and glasses and the gentle hum of air conditioning. Yet beneath the surface, tension was building. Clara could sense it, though she didn't yet know that she was at the center of it. For now, she carried on as she always did, quiet, humble, and strong. But life has a way of revealing hidden strengths at the most unexpected moments. Tonight, Clara's strength would soon be tested, and the piano in the corner, dusty and silent, was waiting for her to answer its call. The evening had settled into its rhythm. Plates clattered softly, wine glasses gleamed under the golden lights, and gentle conversations floated through the air. But at the center table where the rich man sat, something was shifting. His sharp eyes kept wandering toward the corner of the restaurant, where the old upright piano stood silently, its polished wood catching the glow of the chandeliers. It wasn't a beautiful piano anymore. The edges were worn, the keys slightly yellowed from years of use. Yet it held a quiet dignity, like an old storyteller waiting for someone to listen again. Most nights, a hired musician would sit at the bench and let melodies fill the room, giving life to dinners and softening the clink of silverware. But tonight no musician had come, and the piano remained silent. The rich man leaned back in his chair, swirling his glass of red wine with a grin that carried no warmth. His laughter, sharp and loud, had already unsettled the room earlier, but now his smirk carried something darker, an idea, born out of boredom and arrogance. His eyes landed on Clara, the waitress who had served him with patience all night, never showing the irritation she must have felt. He had mocked her once already, but the cruel satisfaction hadn't been enough. He wanted more. He wanted to see her crack. He snapped his fingers loudly, the sound echoing through the restaurant. Conversations paused. Guests looked up, startled. Clara turned, unsure if he was calling for her. When she saw his finger pointing directly at her, she walked toward the table, keeping her head low and her step steady. "Yes, sir?" she asked softly, her voice polite, though her heart beat a little faster. The rich man leaned forward, his smile stretching wider. He gestured with his hand toward the piano. "That thing over there," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "Go on, play it." For a moment, Clara thought she had misheard him. "Excuse me?" she asked carefully. "You heard me," he said, chuckling under his breath. "Play the piano. I want to see what kind of talent a waitress like you could possibly have." The words carried a sharp edge disguised as amusement. He didn't expect music. He expected embarrassment. To him, this was entertainment, forcing someone he considered beneath him to perform just to satisfy his cruel curiosity. A hush fell over the restaurant. Guests exchanged uneasy glances. Some shifted in their seats, uncomfortable but unwilling to interfere. The staff froze in their tracks, watching anxiously, but no one dared to step forward. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She had always been careful to keep her love of music hidden at work. She was there to serve food, not to share her private passion. And now, being ordered like this, she felt the sting of humiliation rise in her chest. Her face grew warm, though she kept her composure. I'm not here to play, sir," she said gently, hoping the moment would pass. But the rich man only laughed louder, attracting more attention. "Oh, don't be shy. We're all waiting. What harm could it do? Surely even you can press a few keys." His words sliced the air like knives, each one designed to belittle her. Clara glanced at the piano. Memories rushed back. Her little apartment, the second-hand keyboard she had practiced on for years, the nights when she poured her heart into the music, unseen by the world. The piano was her safe place, her secret, and now it was being turned into a stage for mockery. Her hands trembled slightly as she clasped her tray tighter. Around her, she felt the eyes of strangers. Some looked at her with pity, others with curiosity, but none with the kind of respect she longed for. The manager of the restaurant hovered nearby, clearly nervous but unwilling to confront the wealthy man. After all, he was a paying customer, and in places like this, money often spoke louder than fairness. "Go on," the rich man pressed, his grin widening. "Don't keep us waiting." He clapped his hands once as if signaling the start of a show. His friends at the table chuckled quietly, eager to see what humiliation might unfold. Clara's heart pounded in her chest. 1,000 thoughts raced through her mind. She could refuse and risk losing her job. She could obey and risk her dignity. Either way, the choice felt cruel. The piano seemed to call to her again, its silence almost daring her to break it. Her mother's words echoed faintly in her memory. "Music will always be your voice." She swallowed hard, forcing down the lump in her throat. She didn't answer the man right away. Instead, she stood frozen, her eyes locked on the piano. as if deciding whether to turn this cruel command into something more, something that belonged to her, not to him. The room grew tense, every second stretching into silence. Even the waiters carrying trays slowed down, waiting to see what she would do. The rich man leaned back in his chair, confident, smug, certain she would make a fool of herself. But Clara knew something he did not. Inside her was a talent he could never buy, a strength he could never understand. And though fear still knotted in her stomach, another feeling began to stir, a quiet courage rising with every heartbeat. This was not just a command anymore. It was a turning point. Clara stood frozen in place, her tray pressed against her chest as though it were a shield. The restaurant, once filled with the soft clinking of glasses and gentle chatter, had gone completely still. All eyes were on her. It felt as if the entire room was holding its breath, waiting to see what she would do. The rich man lounged in his chair, one arm draped lazily over the backrest, a smug smile curling on his lips. He tapped the stem of his wine glass with a finger, enjoying the tension he had created. To him, this was nothing more than sport, a game of power, a way to remind everyone present that he could bend people to his will. Clara's heart pounded in her chest so loudly, she thought others might hear it. The air around her felt heavy, pressing down on her shoulders, making it hard to breathe. She glanced at the piano again, its dark wood glowing softly under the chandelier. It seemed to stare back at her, waiting. She wanted to refuse. Every part of her body screamed against obeying such a humiliating demand. She wasn't a performer for his amusement. She was a worker here to do her job with dignity. Her hands tightened on the tray until her knuckles turned white. Yet another fear crept in. The fear of what would happen if she said no. She had seen it before. Arrogant customers complaining to the manager, demanding someone be fired, wielding money like a weapon. Clara could not afford to lose this job. It paid for her rent, her groceries, her little brother's school supplies. Saying no might cost her more than her pride. It could cost her survival. Her throat tightened as she looked around the restaurant. Some guests avoided her gaze, pretending to study their menus or sip their drinks. They didn't want to get involved. Others looked at her with pity, their eyes soft but helpless. A few leaned forward, curious, as though waiting for entertainment. The manager stood near the bar, torn. He shifted nervously, clearly aware of the cruelty at play, but too afraid to intervene. After all, this man was wealthy, powerful, and influential. Losing his business could mean trouble for the restaurant. So like everyone else, he stayed silent. Clara felt a strange loneliness in that moment. Though she was surrounded by people, not one of them would stand with her. She was on her own. She turned back to the rich man, hoping maybe he would laugh and wave it off that his demand was just a passing whim. But instead he leaned forward and said louder this time, "Well, don't just stand there, play. Or are you too afraid to try?" The words cut deep, sharper than he realized. He wasn't just mocking her skill. He was mocking her very existence, treating her like a child who needed to be dared into action. His friends chuckled under their breath, fueling his arrogance. Clara's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came out. She hesitated, caught between two worlds. One where she protected her pride by refusing, and one where she risked humiliation to keep her job. Her gaze drifted again to the piano. Memories flooded her mind. Her tiny apartment, her late mother humming in the kitchen, the old keyboard that had been her treasure for so many years. She remembered the nights she played with her eyes closed, letting the music carry her away from the hardships of life. The piano had always been her escape, her sanctuary, but now it threatened to become her prison. Her hands trembled and she set the tray down on a nearby table. A waiter glanced at her, wide-eyed, as though asking silently, "Are you really going to do this?" Clara didn't answer. She barely knew herself. She took a small step forward, then stopped. The sound of her shoe against the polished floor echoed louder than it should have, slicing through the silence. The rich man smirked wider, tilting his head back as if savoring his victory. He believed he had her trapped, and in some ways he was right. Clara closed her eyes for a moment. In that brief darkness, she heard her mother's voice again. "Music will always be your voice. Don't ever let anyone silence it." The memory gave her a flicker of strength, but fear still weighed heavy in her chest. Her hesitation stretched on, filling the room with unbearable tension. Guests shifted in their seats, whispering softly. A child at one table asked their parent what was happening, and the parent hushed them quickly. Even the kitchen staff peered out from behind the swinging doors, drawn by the strange stillness that had overtaken the restaurant. Clara opened her eyes and looked straight at the piano. It was no longer just an instrument in the corner. It was a choice. A dangerous one, yes, but also an opportunity. Maybe, just maybe, she could turn this moment into something more than humiliation. Maybe she could turn it into a voice, a statement, a truth. But still, she hesitated. Fear gripped her like cold chains, and doubt whispered cruelly in her mind. What if I make a mistake? What if they laugh? What if this becomes the worst moment of my life? She took another step forward, then another. The restaurant watched in silence, the sound of her footsteps like a drumbeat marking the approach of something inevitable. Her chest tightened, but her chin lifted slightly, almost unconsciously. The rich man raised his glass, toasting her mockingly as she moved closer. That's it, he said in a voice dripping with false encouragement. Let's see the show. But Clara was no performer for his amusement. Though she didn't know it yet, the hesitation that gripped her now was not weakness. It was the gathering of strength before the storm. And when she finally sat before that piano, the world would never look at her the same way again. Clara's footsteps felt heavier with every move she made toward the piano. The soft murmur of the restaurant had disappeared, replaced by an almost unbearable silence. Even the clinking of glasses and the scraping of cutlery had stopped. It was as if the entire room had paused, the air thick with anticipation. She walked slowly, her heart racing so fast it almost hurt. Her palms were sweaty, and her throat was dry, but her back was straight. Each step was a battle between fear and courage. She could feel the eyes of everyone on her, piercing, judging, waiting. Behind her, the rich man leaned back in his chair, sipping his wine with a smug satisfaction. His friends whispered among themselves, chuckling softly, already convinced that Clara was about to make a fool of herself. He was enjoying this moment, certain that his power was unquestioned, his command obeyed. But inside Clara, something was shifting. At first, she had moved only out of fear. Fear of losing her job, fear of being reported to her manager, fear of the consequences of disobedience. Yet as her eyes locked on the piano, the fear began to mingle with something stronger. She remembered her childhood again. Those quiet nights when she sat at her old keyboard, her fingers stumbling at first, then slowly learning the language of music. She remembered how the music carried her away from the struggles of life. The empty refrigerator, the overdue bills, her mother's tired smile. She remembered how for those few minutes she was free, and in that memory a fire began to burn. This wasn't just about obeying a cruel command anymore. This wasn't just about fear of losing a job. This was about reclaiming her dignity. If she played, it would not be for him. It would not be for his amusement or his mockery. It would be for herself, for her mother, for her brother, for every silent dream she had carried inside her heart. Clara reached the piano. Her hand brushed against its polished surface, cool and smooth under her trembling fingers. She stood still for a moment, her chest rising and falling rapidly as she tried to steady her breath. The room was so quiet she could hear the faint ticking of the restaurant's wall clock. She pulled the bench out slowly, the scraping sound against the floor making some guests flinch. She sat down carefully, adjusting her posture like she had done countless times in her small apartment. Her fingers hovered above the keys, but she didn't press them yet. Behind her, the rich man smirked and said loudly, "Don't disappoint us now. We're all waiting." His voice was thick with mockery, but Clara didn't turn to look at him. For the first time that night, she chose not to acknowledge him at all. Instead, she closed her eyes. In that silence, she heard her mother's words again. "Music will always be your voice. Don't let anyone take it from you." A single tear threatened to fall, but she blinked it away, not out of sadness, but out of determination. She had made her choice. She would play, not because she was told to, but because her soul demanded it. Her fingers pressed the first key. The sound rang out, soft yet clear, echoing across the silent restaurant. It was like a spark in the darkness, small but powerful. Clara's hands moved to the next notes, then the next, and suddenly the piano was alive under her touch. She didn't think about the people watching. She didn't think about the man mocking her. She let herself fall into the music, the way she always did when no one else was around. Her body relaxed, her hands gliding across the keys with grace and certainty. The melody grew stronger, richer, filling every corner of the restaurant. Conversations that had been silenced did not return. No one dared to speak now. Guests leaned forward, eyes wide, as the waitress they had ignored moments ago transformed into something else entirely. Clara poured her heart into every note. Her fingers danced, her soul spoke, and the piano answered. The music was not just sound, it was her story, her pain, her strength, her hope. It carried with it the long nights of practice, the tears she shed in silence, the unspoken dreams she never shared. For a moment, she forgot where she was. She wasn't in a restaurant anymore. She wasn't wearing a uniform or being watched by strangers. She was simply herself, a musician, an artist, a woman who had found her voice. The rich man's smirk slowly faded. He leaned forward, his wine glass forgotten in his hand. His friends stopped chuckling, their smiles replaced with awe. None of them had expected this. They had come for humiliation, but they were witnessing brilliance. Clara's music swelled, powerful and unrelenting. The guests who had pitied her now looked at her with admiration. Some even felt ashamed for not stepping in earlier. She had taken a cruel command and transformed it into a stage of triumph. When she struck the final chord, the sound lingered in the air like a breath held too long. Then silence. Pure, heavy silence. Clara lifted her hands from the keys and placed them gently on her lap. She did not look around. She simply closed her eyes and inhaled deeply, feeling the weight of what she had just done. In that silence, the rich man was left with nothing. No words, no laughter, no mockery. His arrogance had been silenced by something he could never control, true talent. And Clara, for the first time in her life, felt truly seen. The first notes had already silenced the restaurant, but what came after was unlike anything anyone had expected. Clara's fingers, once trembling with hesitation, now glided confidently across the piano keys. The sound was not just music, it was alive, weaving itself into the very air, wrapping around every listener like an invisible embrace. The melody began soft, almost fragile, like a whisper testing its strength, but soon it grew bolder, flowing like a river breaking free from its dam. Each note carried with it a piece of Clara's soul, her struggles, her pain, her hopes, her dreams. She was no longer a waitress in a faded uniform. In that moment, she was an artist, a storyteller, a force of nature. The rich man's smirk vanished. He had expected clumsy fingers and sour notes, something he could laugh at and use to belittle her. Instead, his eyes widened, the wine glass in his hand forgotten as he leaned forward, unable to look away. His friends, who had prepared themselves for laughter, now sat stiff and silent, their jaws slightly open. The guests at the surrounding tables were spellbound. Forks hovered halfway to mouths, conversations cut short, eyes fixed on Clara as if she were the only person in the room. Even the waiters and kitchen staff stopped in their tracks, peeking from behind doors and counters, drawn to the sound like moths to a flame. Clara closed her eyes as she played, shutting out the stares, shutting out the man who had forced her into this moment. She wasn't playing for them, not anymore. She was playing for herself, for the girl who had once sat on a second-hand keyboard in a cramped apartment, dreaming of this very feeling. She was playing for her late mother, whose words had carried her through the hardest nights. She was playing for every invisible soul who had ever been mocked, dismissed, or overlooked. Her body swayed slightly with the rhythm, her fingers moving faster now, more daring, more alive. The melody shifted, rising and falling like a conversation between her heart and the world. There was sorrow in the notes, but also defiance, also hope. It was music that told a story without words, and everyone in that restaurant understood it, even if they couldn't explain why. A woman at one table felt tears prick her eyes. A man at another table shook his head slowly in disbelief, as though wondering how such beauty had been hidden in plain sight. The silence in the room was no longer heavy with tension. It was sacred, as though everyone present knew they were witnessing something unforgettable. The piano keys clicked under Clara's touch, but the sound that filled the space was more than just mechanics. It was magic. Pure, undeniable magic. The kind that slips past the mind and dives straight into the soul. Even the children in the restaurant, who normally would have squirmed in their chairs or fidgeted with boredom, sat still with wide eyes, captivated by the sight of a waitress who had become something far greater. For the rich man, the transformation was almost unbearable to watch. The power he thought he held over her had dissolved the moment her fingers touched the keys. He had wanted to humiliate her, but now he was the one humiliated. Not through ridicule, but through awe. His arrogance had been exposed as small and shallow against the vast ocean of her talent. Clara played on, her hands moving as though guided by something beyond her control. She wasn't thinking about what note came next. She wasn't even thinking at all. The music was flowing through her, using her as its vessel, and for the first time in her life she didn't feel invisible. She felt powerful. She felt seen. The song reached its peak, the notes swelling, filling the restaurant with a wave of sound so strong that some guests held their breath, afraid to break the spell. Then slowly Clara guided the melody down, softer and softer until it was no more than a whisper again. And then, silence. Her hands hovered above the keys for a moment before gently falling into her lap. Her chest rose and fell as she tried to steady her breathing. She did not open her eyes right away. She sat there in the silence, letting the echoes of her music linger in the room. No one moved. No one spoke. It was as if time itself had stopped, caught in the aftermath of what they had just heard. Clara finally opened her eyes and looked down at her hands. For a moment she almost didn't recognize them. These were not just the hands of a waitress carrying trays and cleaning tables. These were the hands of an artist, the hands of someone who had just bared her soul to the world. The rich man stared at her, his mouth slightly open, his face pale. He tried to form words, but none came. The man who had walked in with so much pride and arrogance now looked small, diminished, stripped of his false power. The applause did not come immediately. It was as though the audience needed time to process what they had witnessed. But then, like the breaking of a dam, it burst forth. Guests clapped, some standing to their feet, their faces glowing with admiration. The sound filled the restaurant, loud and joyous, washing over Clara like a wave of validation. Clara lowered her head slightly, humbled, but not broken. She hadn't played for their applause. She hadn't played for their approval. She had played for herself, and that was enough. But in doing so, she had also given them a gift they would never forget. For a long moment after the final note faded, the restaurant hung in silence. It was not the silence of boredom or emptiness, but the heavy, sacred kind that follows something extraordinary. Clara sat still on the bench, her hands resting gently in her lap. Her head bowed slightly as though she, too, was catching her breath. The applause had erupted, loud and thunderous, filling the room with admiration. Guests clapped until their hands stung, some rising to their feet without even realizing it. But beneath the cheers there was something else, an unspoken understanding that they had just witnessed a truth greater than wealth, greater than arrogance. Clara finally rose from the piano bench. She didn't bow, she didn't smile grandly. She simply stood and stepped back, her dignity intact, her spirit calm. For her, this wasn't a performance. It was a release, a reclaiming of the voice she had always carried inside. But while the crowd celebrated her, the man who had mocked her sat frozen. His wine glass, half empty, trembled slightly in his hand. His lips, once twisted in smirks and sneers, were parted as though searching for words that would not come. His eyes were wide, but not with joy, with shock, with disbelief, and with the quiet sting of humiliation. For the first time that night, he was not the center of attention. He was invisible. The power he had flaunted, the arrogance he had displayed, all of it crumbled in the face of Clara's undeniable talent. The laughter he had prepared, the mockery he had planned, had been stolen from him. And in its place was silence, an uncomfortable, suffocating silence that wrapped itself around his pride like chains. His friends shifted awkwardly beside him. Just minutes ago, they had leaned back in their chairs, ready to laugh at Clara's expense. Now they avoided his eyes, their smirks wiped clean, their faces stiff with shame. They clapped weakly along with the others, but the sound of their applause was hollow, insincere. They had been complicit in his cruelty, and now they too were exposed. The rich man tried to recover, forcing a chuckle that died quickly in his throat. He raised his glass slightly as if to mask his discomfort, but his hand shook too much. He set it down with a clink louder than he intended, drawing a few glances from nearby tables. For the first time in a long time he felt small. He wanted to speak, to say something clever or dismissive, but the words stuck in his throat. What could he say? That she was lucky? That it didn't matter? No, none of that would work. Not now. Not after what everyone had just witnessed. Clara had revealed a truth so powerful that no insult, no mockery could touch it. She had won, not through confrontation, but through grace. The applause finally began to fade, replaced once more by silence. This time, however, it was different. It wasn't the tense, expectant silence from before. It was a silence of awe, of humility, of quiet respect. Guests looked at Clara with admiration, nodding subtly, their eyes soft. Some even smiled at her as though to say, "You showed us something we will never forget." Clara, however, didn't bask in their stares. She didn't seek validation or applause. She simply returned to her duties, picking up the tray she had set down earlier. Her steps steady, her head held high. She was the same waitress she had been at the start of the night, yet something about her had changed. Or perhaps something had been revealed. The truth of who she really was, no longer hidden. The rich man followed her with his eyes as she walked past his table. For the first time, he could not meet her gaze. His usual confidence faltered, replaced with an unfamiliar heaviness in his chest. Shame. It was a feeling he was not accustomed to. He was a man used to power, used to respect given out of fear or money. But this was different. Respect had been earned in front of his eyes, not bought. And it had been earned by someone he had considered beneath him. The silence inside him grew louder, pressing against his chest, reminding him of his cruelty. He shifted in his seat, uncomfortable in a way he had never been before. The expensive suit on his shoulders suddenly felt heavy. The gold watch on his wrist felt meaningless. For once, his wealth could not protect him from the truth. The truth was simple. He had tried to mock a woman, and instead she had humbled him with her brilliance. Around him, people were no longer looking at him with curiosity or admiration. They looked past him, their attention fixed only on Clara. He had been dethroned, stripped of the false crown of arrogance he wore so proudly. And in that humbling silence, he understood something he had never considered before. Money could buy many things. Fancy clothes, expensive meals, the illusion of respect, but it could never buy dignity. It could never buy talent. And it could never buy the kind of strength Clara had just shown. For the first time in years, the rich man lowered his head. Clara returned to her duties as if nothing extraordinary had happened. She picked up the tray she had set aside, adjusted it carefully in her hands, and began to move between tables again. But the restaurant was not the same anymore. Every step she took was followed by eyes that no longer saw her as just a waitress. Customers leaned toward each other, whispering softly about what they had just witnessed. Some smiled warmly as she passed by, their admiration written clearly on their faces. Others gave her subtle nods of respect, the kind of acknowledgement that was more powerful than words. The quiet dignity she carried with her had grown into something undeniable. She had revealed a strength that no uniform, no job title, no insult could hide. The applause had died down, but its echo still lived in the air. The memory of her music clung to the walls, lingered in the hearts of every person present. The piano, once silent and unnoticed, now stood like a monument in the corner of the room, a reminder of what had just happened. Clara did not seek attention. She did not bask in the stares or the whispered praise. She continued her work with the same humility she had shown all night, refilling glasses, clearing plates, and smiling politely. Yet there was a difference now. Her steps were steadier, her head higher. She had not just survived humiliation, she had transformed it into triumph. The rich man sat in silence, his arrogance shattered. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his hands fidgeting with the napkin on his lap. He could not look at Clara directly. Every time she walked past, he felt a sting in his chest, a reminder of how he had tried to break her only to be broken himself. His friends no longer laughed with him. They sat quietly, their eyes downcast, ashamed of their own part in his cruelty. For the first time in his life, the rich man felt truly powerless. Money had always been his shield, his weapon, his pride, but in that moment, surrounded by strangers who no longer admired him, he understood how fragile his power really was. It was nothing compared to the kind of power Clara carried within her, the power of true talent, true dignity, and true strength. When Clara came to his table to clear his plate, she did so with the same calm professionalism she had shown to every other guest. She did not gloat, did not smirk, did not remind him of what he had done. She simply performed her duties with quiet grace. That, more than anything, humbled him further. She had no need to prove herself, she already had. He opened his mouth, perhaps to apologize, perhaps to compliment her playing, but the words stuck in his throat. What could he possibly say? Nothing would be enough. No apology could erase the cruelty he had shown. No praise could undo the insult he had given. He lowered his head, his voice failing him, his pride in tatters. The other guests, however, did not hold back their admiration. As Clara moved through the room, several reached out to shake her hand. Others thanked her warmly, and a few even asked if she had ever performed professionally. Their kindness was genuine, born not from pity, but from respect. One older gentleman placed a hand on her shoulder and said softly, "You have a gift, young lady. Don't ever stop sharing it with the world." Clara smiled politely, her eyes shining with quiet gratitude. She did not tell him how much those words meant to her. She simply nodded and continued on, carrying his encouragement in her heart. By the end of the evening, the atmosphere in the restaurant had completely transformed. What had begun as a night of arrogance and cruelty ended as a night of inspiration and awe. Guests left with more than full stomachs. They left with a story they would tell for years. And Clara, though exhausted, felt lighter than she ever had before. She had faced humiliation and turned it into a stage. She had been mocked and turned it into music. She had been commanded, but she had chosen to rise, to shine, to be heard. The rich man left quietly, his head bowed, his usual swagger gone. He did not boast, did not command, did not sneer. He slipped out of the restaurant like a shadow, humbled and silent, carrying with him a lesson he had never expected to learn. As the doors closed behind him, Clara glanced once more at the piano in the corner. It looked the same as before, yet to her it was different now. It was no longer just a piece of furniture in a restaurant. It was the place where she had found her voice, the place where she had turned pain into power, the place where she had been seen. And though she said nothing, Clara knew in her heart that her life had changed. The respect she had earned that night was not just from the guests or even from the man who had mocked her. It was the respect she had earned for herself. She walked back to the kitchen with her tray balanced in her hands, her uniform still the same, her work still unfinished. But inside, she carried something priceless: dignity, courage, and the knowledge that her talent was undeniable. And for the first time in a long time, Clara smiled, not the polite smile of a waitress serving strangers, but the true, radiant smile of a woman who had discovered her worth.